You're watching The Science Behind Happiness by Dr. Lissa Gall on Resonance Wellness TV, part of our Whole Life Medicine Alleviate series. Keep in the loop about future webinars and events on whole-life-medicine.com. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to The Science Behind Happiness. My name is Dr. Lissa Gall, and I'll be your host and guide this evening about all things happy. So most of my free webinars have covered aspects of Alleviate, which has much more to do with looking at root causes, the need for detox, and the identification of missing ingredients. But our lecture tonight will focus on points from the perspective of Align from the Whole Life Medicine model. And that's the second step in health strategy at Resonance Wellness. And hopefully it will give you a taster of what's possible as you up-level your health. Because in Align, patients are learning what needs to change to have a transformational experience of themselves. So in this lecture, we're going to be talking about a component that has a big bearing on happiness, which is the road to awareness. Level 2 healing in Align really does require us to recognize the pattern of what's been created in us. So who or what is at the controls? And what do we know or learn subconsciously that sets us up for what we're experiencing? That's a really crucial tipping point into a truly different place of understanding your health and seeing your health picture as the result of and the cause of what you hold in your awareness can really liberate function and bring you to center. So I think you're going to see what I mean as we spend just a little bit of time investigating the topic of happiness. So we're going to start here with the definition of happiness, which you would think is relatively easy to do, but the dictionary defines happiness as the state of being happy, which sounds obvious, but it is really a bit ambiguous. Other definitions can include good fortune or a state of well-being or contentment, a pleasurable or satisfying experience, but I don't think any of these really explain what happiness is. The ancient Greeks defined happiness as the joy that we feel when we're striving after our potential. Aristotle said that happiness is a state of activity. So when asked about the requirements for happiness, Eleanor Roosevelt said that it's a feeling that you have been honest with yourself and those around you, a feeling that you've done the best you could, both in your personal life and your work, and the ability to love others. And famous Canadian, Michael J. Fox, said, "My happiness grows in direct proportion to my acceptance and in inverse proportion to my expectations." And, you know, he's actually got some key features there that we're going to see today. So the field of psychology describes happiness as the experience of more positive emotions like joy or interest and pride than negative emotions, such as sadness, anxiety, and anger. So maybe we're getting a little closer with each one of these definitions. But to get a bit more specific, let's consider this definition. Happiness is the appreciation of life and moments of pleasure, but overall, it has to do with the positive experience of emotions. So you can think for a moment about how would you define happiness yourself? It's a pretty challenging question. So in English, I feel like we have a poverty of expressions on about happiness. Mostly I'm saying this because I'm familiar with other languages and other locations that treat it differently. And having lived in the United Kingdom for a year, I can say that happy and not happy are really only very marginally delineated in that country in expression. Everybody has very stiff upper lip. Nobody wants to get too excited. Whooping it up even in the pub is just frowned upon. But in other languages, we have words like in Italian, we have this word fiero. It's a kind of happiness that you accomplish something in the face of a challenge. In Yiddish, I'm gonna like not say this correctly, but I think it's dachis. It's a pride in one's children. But my personal favorite is this German expression. It's Schadenfreude. It means joy in other people's misfortunes. It's a German word. And I'm going to give you two examples of this because it totally cracks me. It actually makes me happy to talk about Schadenfreude, which is maybe saying a lot about my personality. But there's a German word, and it's Vulva Pax und Freude, which in English translates literally as well wrapping pleasure. And if you're going to translate it into English, it would be kind of like the uncomplicated delight of the perfectly wrapped parcel. And there's a lot of excitement about parcels in Germans. I grew up with my Oma and Opa. They were perfect illustrations of that. My Opa used to be so excited. Did you get your parcel? It's a big thing. It's like brown paper packages wrapped up in string. That's where that whole thing comes from, Sound of Music. Or there's another example that I think is a great example. There's a word that's Begierde. It literally translates as fear desire, but basically it means the attraction to something you fear or find unpleasant, so it's like poking the dead thing in the street. So interestingly, worldwide, nobody has a single word for being happy for another person. Everybody worldwide fakes that. There's no specific word for that emotion. So I think it's interesting, because when we look at language, it's so indicative sometimes about how we truly feel about things. So it was cracking me up researching even the definition of happiness. So next, I wanted to kind of lay one major association that people have with happiness, and that is that we assume our happiness is related to material circumstances. So this is a graph that it's a study by Engelhardt and Klingman from 2000, and we can really see reality checks on this concept. So this is a graph where people were reporting themselves, their happiness on happiness index. It's actually the survival and well-being index that was formulated for this study and many others. And on the bottom is showing the income of the people. And so this is plotting countries, so individuals from various countries, and there's a lot of data. So you can see that countries are differing substantially here in their levels of well-being. So societies with higher well-being are definitely those that are more economically developed. They usually have very effective governments, low levels of corruption. They have high levels of trust. They can meet citizens' basic needs for food and health. And cultural factors certainly also play a role in national estimates of well-being. Obviously here, where the basics of life are lacking on the survival and well-being index, happiness is reported as low. So we're seeing here that there's, as an example, at the bottom of the index and the bottom of the income, Zimbabwe. And what these circles are showing here is like roughly what they're doing is circling around a handful of different unifying factors. This particular graph doesn't show all of the different subgroups that are related, but what's really interesting is that countries, generally speaking, cluster if in either geographical or social relationship to each other. What you'll also notice on this graph is that we're quite high up on the happiness index, even though our income is not the highest. But the point of this graph really is to show that at some point, income doesn't change your happiness level very much. And so on the far left, where you're making major economic gains, you do definitely see it correlating with happiness. But then as you get to be a certain threshold, it stops being as big of a factor. And most people are fairly surprised that that's the case. Everybody assumes it just goes up the more money that you have, but it really doesn't. So I wanted to kind of put that to rest kind of here at the beginning, not to rest, but at least give you that sense of that's not one of the factors that makes the biggest difference. So when we discuss happiness, we actually have to get clear about a couple of things. The first thing is we have to get clear on the difference between a feeling and an emotion. And those are usually lumped into one category for most people, but they really are not the same thing. There's a researcher, Dr. Antonio Damaso, who's from the University of Iowa, who has done some brilliant research on the experiences of feeling and emotion based on PET imaging. So PET is a positron emission scanner. It's a type of scanner that allows you to see changes in brain activity based on the uptake of glucose, which is the main fuel for the brain. So in a PET scanner, you've actually injected the person being studied with a radioactive glucose. And where the brain's most active, you see it light up with radioactivity. And so this allows you to observe live what happens when people have various types of inner experiences. And what he found out was that brain activity does alter depending on what type of experience the person has, but it is really not an either or brain activity. So happiness is not the opposite of unhappiness. So based on this work, he was also able to show that emotions and feelings are different. So emotions are those automatic responses of the body to a specific situation. So a body association to what occurs. You blush red. If you're embarrassed, you kind of go flushed red when lying. There's like that flash of eye brightness when you're happy. There's heart flutter. So a feeling is different. It's the conscious perception of that emotion as being pleasurable or not. So emotions are unconscious, feelings are conscious. So emotions, the unconscious registering of your body to the situation, really allows you to make a decision quickly. So the only problem with that is that human decisions are becoming substantially more complex over time. So a quick emotion could result in making a hasty action that you could really regret. If people lose their capacity to have emotions, and that can happen in certain types of brain damage, either by accident or by stroke or whatever, they usually start to make poor decisions. So if they're affecting the emotional centers in the brain, you start to see discombobulation. And what's interesting is even if you very, very specifically are injuring emotion areas or interpretation of emotion areas, we tell people in our culture that to be rational. So what's interesting is that you can damage your brain into actually technically being more rational and preserve your intelligence. But ultimately, the people who have an injury like that with preserved intelligence and rationality, but no emotion, cannot make proper decisions. So this really blows out of the water the whole Star Trek Mr. Spock thing, because in essence, by research, what we're showing is you can't exist as a Mr. Spock and actually make an intelligent decision, which clearly he does all the time on Star Trek. So I've heard many people express that emotions are their problem, but really it's not the emotions that are the problem. It's how we fail to understand our emotions and our feelings that is the problem. And so I'm going to quote another researcher here, Dan Gilbert, whose work we're going to see in a few minutes. And he stated, only when we're conscious of our emotions are we free to follow them or no. So perceiving feelings gives us flexibility. Dogs would never go bungee jumping. They would be prevented by unconscious fear. And so human beings have some very interesting things that we're going to take a look at next. One of them is the universal face. So I absolutely adore this photo of the little kid and the camel. It's one of my favorite photos. I love it because it makes me smile too, which is at least partially biological. Experiments have shown that all humans come equipped with the same emotions. The newborn will smile. Blind people who have never seen a smile will smile. People who are culturally very separate use the exact same facial movements. In fact, there are no cultural variations in this expression at all. Only some cultures who are better describing their emotions than others, which is what we illustrated in the Germans and the Italians and the Yiddish, or the Jewish, I mean. So the facial movements of happiness are universally recognized. There's studies that have shown where research have actually attempted to prove that primitive cultures don't have the same facial expressions or emotions as their more cultured counterparts, which of course turned out to be totally untrue. A true smile is instantly recognizable, and it's very difficult not to return it. It consists of engagement of the muscles around the eye, which you can see in this illustration, and the mouth. Here in this diagram, we see the difference between a social smile, a spontaneous smile, and a full smile. And we can all see the difference. And you can probably even feel the difference in what this person's face looks like in the recollection of your own face making that expression. You know how each of these expressions feels inside your own face. So experimentally, Paul Ekman, another researcher, showed that a smile, even if you have to force it onto your face, will create identical brain activity to a well-told joke in happiness factor. It does have to be as genuine a smile as possible, though. So in the experiment, he actually had to teach people how to engage the muscles in a genuine smile to get the best results in inner experience. So in essence, we can smile our way into a better emotion and then have the feeling. So the more practice you have at this, I think, the better. Now, let's consider how people view happiness. And again, we're going to come back to the money question, the material question. It's always an interesting one. There's fascinating research done by Dr. Dan Gilbert that I just mentioned that examines how people respond to choices that one might assume would make us happy. So in one experiment, he asked people to choose what would make them happier, winning the lottery or becoming a paraplegic. Now, of course, everyone thinks they know the answer to that question. However, further research shows that after a year of actually having either won the lottery or having become a paraplegic, both the lottery winners and the paraplegics reported about the same level of happiness, both from before and after their accident and between each other. It actually wasn't hugely statistically significant, the difference between a former or a lottery winner and a paraplegic. In fact, there's studies that found that after only 3 months, many types of major life trauma, with a few exceptions, had no impact on overall reported happiness. And I am sure that there is nervous laughter out there. So if we look at the experience of happiness, we can either experience happiness as the result of something that actually happens, or the result of something that we have become happy about. So there's research that shows you can experience two types of happiness: a natural happiness and the happiness that we have synthesized internally. So natural happiness is the result of getting something we wanted or we think we wanted. And synthesized happiness is what we experience when we don't get what we wanted, but we find a way to live with it anyway. And Dr. Gilbert's gone further to explain that we're equipped with a brain area that allows us to have both of these types of happiness. So the experience of the two types of happiness has to do with the existence of the prefrontal cortex. That is a component in the brain that the rest of the mammalian world, so including the monkeys and every other mammal, have not developed as markedly as humans. The frontal lobe is the part of the brain located directly behind the forehead. And in general, that broad section is responsible for behavior, learning, personality, and voluntary movement. At the very front of our frontal lobe and a little underneath is an area called the prefrontal cortex. And this area of the brain appears to have a very special function in humans. It serves as an experience simulator. So human beings can have experiences in their heads before they try them out in real life. An experience simulator basically allows us to imagine an experience without actually undergoing that experience. No other animal has this ability so obviously well developed, which probably is the reason why dogs have not invented bungee jumping. So this means that if you have the capacity to imagine that something's happening, and even if it hasn't happened, you will have something akin to having that experience. So like we've discussed this in previous lectures, and hopefully you've heard me say this in clinic, your brain can't tell the difference between something that's happened or something that you're imagining is happening. In short, we're co-creators of our own inner experiences because this part of us allows us to be. So what this implies is that it's impossible to create your own happiness. Our society, however, has strong beliefs that synthetic happiness is inferior to natural happiness. And what's interesting is that the biggest impact on happiness can be how you make choices. It turns out that the freedom to choose sometimes is the enemy of synthesized happiness. So the psychological immune system works best when we're totally trapped. When you have no choice, you find a way to be happy with what's happened. In contrast, if you have reversible conditions, that is not always conducive to happiness. So if there's a choice to reverse, you can actually create misery in a person. Now, isn't that interesting? You know, We live in a country where people are often determining that what they do is going to be on perceived happiness, and they sometimes seem rarely to find it. Well, there are lots of people around the world that have zero choice in how they live, and they are just as happy. So there's a Shakespearean quote that you have to think of with respect to this, and that is the quote, "'Tis nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so." So if we quote this researcher again, Dan Gilbert, he had said, "When our ambition is bounded, it allows us to work joyfully. When it is unbounded, it leads us to lie, cheat, steal, hurt others, and sacrifice things of real value. When our fears are bounded, we're prudent, we're cautious, we're thoughtful. And when our fears are unbounded and overblown, we're reckless and we're cowardly." Another aspect of brain function that I wanted to mention that's important is that there is a sidedness to some of the circuitry involved in our internal experience. So the left side of your brain tends to be more involved in positive feelings, and the right side tends to be more negative. So damage to one side or the other does have a ramification. You could actually have a stroke on the right and be substantially happier, possibly out of touch with reality, but definitely happier. And if you're more left side dominant in your normal brain function, you're not only happier, but you also make more antibodies and immune challenges. So it's an interesting set of conditions. And again, I want to reemphasize, it is not perfectly black and white here for sure. But what we're seeing behaviorally is that there are some interesting issues that come up around happiness, around our perception of happiness. And in fact, biologically, you have a preference for negative. People's brains respond more easily and more quickly to the negative. All you have to do is look at a news broadcast. Unhappiness comes to us so easily. We watch the news that's negative because it's negative. And, some people have really suffered with this in this last year and a bit. Such fear, such terror, and just hearing it over and over and over again. There's rarely something happy to report. So science has also shown us many other kinds of examples. And researcher Nancy Etkoff, who is from Harvard Medical School, has shared a couple of points that can really illustrate this bias. For example, we detect sweet at 1 part per 200 biologically. Bitter, we can pick out at 1 part per 2 million. People hate to lose more than they love to win. And there are experiments that show this bias when playing games or even playing life, that we would much rather be cautious and not lose what we already have than play to win. There's also something known as the marriage formula, or it's known as the 5-to-1 ratio, where we know that to have a happy marriage relationship, you must have 5 positive comments exchanged per 1 negative one. Otherwise, you are statistically more likely to divorce. And then, of course, we have stress response overkills. Our systems are over-designed to respond to emergencies, even if there are none. It's actually better if there are a few, so that we can go all the way through the process to actually terminate the response. But of course, we live in a place where really there's only so many things that are true emergencies. So if we were governed only by pleasure seeking, we would biologically not survive. Pleasure is existing to lure us into positive situations. But to find happy, not just pleasure, but to find happy, you do really have to work on it. And I'm going to go back to the findings of Nancy Etkoff again. So she is an evolutionary psychologist and instructor of the science of happiness, like I said, at Harvard Medical School. And her findings do reinforce things we should have known all along, like the fact that having flowers in the house makes us happier. She even says we're wired to pursue happiness, to enjoy it, and to want more and more of it. And that happiness is contagious, and then our happiness will have positive effects on our friends and even our friends' friends. It basically spreads like a disease. But her research into question of happiness also exposes some surprising results. And one of the key points in the science of happiness is that happiness and unhappiness are not endpoints of a single continuum. I did mention this before, but if you get less miserable, you don't necessarily get happier. There's systems that work in parallel. It is not the same system. So I'm sure many of you have also heard me say this is true of stressors as well. A fun event doesn't cancel out a tragic one. Our lives are not a pile of plus and minus signs. So happiness is really more of a process where you're getting the addition of small things that move you in that direction. And many of our pleasures are innate. The response to the natural world is a great example. Nature is very restorative, and we're going to see some data on that shortly. People generally are happiest when they're absorbed in something or someone else, or sports or sex, because being alone is not natural to the human being. And when we're focusing on me and not we are not as happy in general. We like to imitate empathy and express compassion when we're with other people. Cooperation really lights up our brain reward centers. Happiness can be related to a degree to social status, but it's different than in animals. In animals, dominance is what happens. So there's like a fight for who gets to be the most pleased with him or herself. Humans use additional routes. They have this route, it's called the prestige route, which is related to multiple talents and not just like brute strength. So Einstein may not have been attractive to most people, nor was he a force of dominance, but he is the most famous person worldwide for having been so smart, even if the average person has no idea what he even discovered. And there is some thought that genetic inheritance may determine a certain percentage of happiness. There are experiments on identical twins that show that they are likely to respond similarly to questions about how happy they are. But genes are not determiners because, as we've spoken about before in past lectures, epigenetic factors such as how you grew up or how you were raised has a big influence on gene expression, as does diet and all those other things. So anything that's epigenetic can also have an impact long-term on your happiness. Now, let me preface this next slide here by saying that you have 1 billion synaptic connections in your brain. Happiness versus unhappiness is not the presence or absence of one neurotransmitter. However, there are some correlations between the actions of a neurotransmitter and a final result. For example, serotonin has been called the happy neurotransmitter because of its mood-boosting effects. And lack of this neurotransmitter is associated with depression. But again, your behaviors can change your serotonin. For example, if you focus on positive memories of things you're grateful for, that increases serotonin production. There are also things you can do that are a good habit that increase serotonin production and change your mood, like getting sunshine. So when our skin absorbs sunlight and produces vitamin D, that in turn helps us to produce serotonin. There's also the participating in exercise, such as going for a walk, that also improves people's moods. Now, another neurotransmitter is dopamine. That's known as the pleasure neurotransmitter. It is an increaser of our drive to accomplish a goal so that we get the pleasure of the reward. And this reward system that uses this neurotransmitter dopamine ends in the prefrontal cortex, which we just spoke about. And so people have been shown to increase their dopamine by actually setting goals and then achieving them. And it can be something simple. It doesn't have to be, I achieved world peace this morning. It can be, I made my bed. And exercising also improves dopamine levels, along with serotonin. There's also a chemical named oxytocin that is known as the love hormone, and it's released upon physical contact. So from like childbirth to hugging, oxytocin is there. It provides feelings of love and trust. It is actually a kind of internal opiate. It's found all over the brain, and it works in the entire body as a hormone. So if you get a massage or you have prolonged physical contact, like a good deep hug, that releases oxytocin. So if you hug and cuddle your loved ones often, or whoever you can chase down in your house, your cat, your bear, your teddy bear, anybody that you can find, that will improve your oxytocin levels. So what's interesting to me is the functions of these 3 specific compounds can either be additive in an experience or not. So, for example, with respect to relationships, Lust is related to the hormones epinephrine and testosterone, or estrogen and testosterone. Romantic attraction utilizes the pleasure system, and that includes serotonin and dopamine. But the attachment of long-term relationships uses oxytocin when we form a long-term bond. So anybody in a long-term relationship has possibly had the experience of these items being separate. Like you go from lust to romance to commitment. But there's also examples of where we can maintain all three categories in a relationship by intentional cultivation. Now, we've already looked at the influence of money, which, like I said, increases a little bit of happiness, but the effect is relatively small. So when people pursue money, they forget the other pleasures of life. So the wanting system, kind of equivalent to the lust system in early relationship, overrides the pleasure system. And we're not as pleased with our accomplishments. So we have to intentionally cultivate appreciation to maintain the happiness of the things that we accomplish money-wise. And we're going to look at this further in just a moment. I just wanted to point out that there are a couple of other modifiers of your experience that have been posed related to the polyvagal theory of Stephen Borges. And I don't know if you've heard about this. It's become a lot more of a buzzword I've seen in the alternative health community, although this is not a new theory. This is an understanding of how our body reacts to various challenges based on the evolution of the nervous system over time. So Dr. Borges had this thought that there are older circuits in the brainstem that can be inhibited by higher circuits. So our reactions to the world, the newest circuit is the social engagement system. So the muscles of talking and facial expression and listening. So this is linked to the nerve also that regulates the heart. And when this system doesn't work, we see symptoms of dysregulation, like a fight or flight reaction. And if this is not enough, there's a fear system that creates total shutdown and immobilization. So there are lots of responses your body is doing innately that your cortex, your highest part of your brain, is trying to explain when a person has undergone trauma. Like an example would be, if people get into a situation where they were completely shut down during an attack, like a mugging or an attack on their person. They have this kind of feeling afterwards, why didn't I fight? But there's aspects of our brainstem. This is in particular to do with the vagus nerve, this cranial nerve 10, that will sometimes trip off this experience of being completely shut down. So if we don't manage to flee, we just freeze and almost get completely outside of ourselves. Now, there's times where trauma signaling can impede our capacity to be in our higher brain centers. So sometimes people are not achieving happiness or something that they would consider to be happiness because they're in a state where using those centers has actually become very difficult to access because the nervous system is in too much stress. So this graph is the reason that I've had so many of you learn detraumatization techniques and learn heart math. It's because if you can learn how to reconnect to higher cortical centers, you can reframe what's happened to you or what's happening to you in the moment. So now on the opposite end of this, I wanted to talk to you about the quantum change. So I don't know if you've heard this expression, but a quantum change refers to a sudden, dramatic, and enduring transformation that affects a really broad range of personal emotion, cognition, and behavior. And this is a phenomenon that has been described since the beginnings of psychology. There's a very famous book in the psychological literature. It's called Varieties of Religious Experience. It's by William James. And this was written quite some time ago. So I pilfered here one of Dr. Joe Dispenza's really awesome quotes and a beautiful picture that he had off of his blog. So I hope you have a chance to go and take a look at his blog. I've put the note there where you can find it. But I'm going to give you this example of quantum change. So there was an experiment in 1994. 55 people shared their stories of personality transformation and sudden, extensive cognitive and behavioral changes. And they termed this type of change a quantum change. So the majority had reported that because of their experience, their lives were much better, and most were confident that their changes would last. So then those people were re-interviewed, and most people remembered quite vividly the experience that they reported 10 years prior that kind of induced them into a personality transformation. And those kind of experiences kind of fell along a continuum. Some people had one of these quantum changes as a one-time event that really dramatically changed the way they lived. Others experienced repeated changes that were either similarly intense to the initial experience or even milder, but then they kind of accrued it as a continuing growth process. And those dramatic changes continued in these people, and none really described a return to old ways of being. There's a really well-known example of this in the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, who had, his name was Bill, and he had a really single mystical experience that completely ended his alcoholism in a moment. He just basically never went back to it. So a quantum change can also be like a sudden jump to a radically different state of being. So the most interesting thing to me that happens when people have had an experience like this, or a set of experiences that have made them change their point of view, their perception of what is important changes. That also means that what makes somebody happy is likely to change. And in fact, in this particular study, they showed that men and women did change their stated values based on experiencing quantum change. So what really drove home to me in this study was that we can think beyond ourselves and really rise above a materialist value when we have a quantum change in life. So here on the left side, we'll see that before a quantum change, women's top 12 most highly valued personal characteristics were family, independence, career, fitting in, attractiveness, knowledge, self-control, being loved. Happiness was there, wealth, faithfulness, and safety. And these are very kind of classical values for the feminine in our culture and others. But what was interesting to me is that after the quantum change, it shifted. It shifted into growth, self-esteem, spirituality. Still, happiness was still there, but there was like generosity, personal peace, honesty, forgiveness, health, creativity, loving, and family. Now, you're basically seeing a change of values to things that are more universal and spiritual. And similar things happened in men. So they went from this kind of classic male values, wealth, adventure, achievement, pleasure, wanting to be respected, wanting to have family and fun and self-esteem and freedom and attractiveness, popularity and power, to these similar kind of, to women, spirituality, personal peace, family, God's will, honesty, growth, humility, faithfulness, forgiveness. I mean, we basically see the feminine and the masculine coming together after a quantum change. I feel that this is fascinating because it means that sometimes what makes us happy could be completely transformed. And then likely the studies that we've talked about so far may not even apply as strongly to individuals who have found that inner spark. And I've certainly observed over time that people's priorities really change. And as people get older, they just appreciate different things. You know, that's that youth is wasted on the young aspect as well. So I think there's also over a lifetime, a tendency to move towards those other values, especially in people who, you know, like many of you that I've known for a while, who are just really attendant to those aspects of life. And I love this quote about it. You know, if your daily life seems poor, don't blame it. Blame yourself that you are not poet enough to call forth its riches. For the Creator, there is no poverty. So let's just take a look at some more research, though, because I think even if you never hit quantum change, there are definitely some things that we can cultivate about happiness. So observing facts about happiness has really not always been on the top of the research pile. This is a relatively new research topic. And it's mostly because we have cultural views about what makes us happy, and we don't usually disagree with them. But sometimes we can get valuable data about happiness from studies that have been designed longer term. So a great example of this is the Harvard Study of Adult Development. It was started in 1938 with 268 students from Harvard College, and it was designed to collect data about physical and mental health over time. Originally, the students would have all been men because Harvard was not open to women at that time. And interestingly, one of the people who's participated in this study was John F. Kennedy, and there were a number of other people who were quite well known that had graduated from Harvard. So every 2 years, this research group would conduct interviews, they would get medical records, and they would complete brain scans of these students over their lifetimes. And then when those students started to pass away, they followed the children of those original students from the original study. And the director of this study stated that the clearest message that they got from the Harvard Study of Adult Development is that good relationships keep us happier and healthier, period. So close relationships, more than money, more than fame, are what keep people happy throughout their lives. So those ties that protect people from life's discontents, they help to delay mental and physical decline, and they're better predictors of long and happy lives than social class, IQ, or yes, even genes. So the important points here are that a happy life isn't always about getting what you want. It can be about learning to enjoy what you get. And that synthetic happiness is not cheating yourself into being happier. It's not a cheat because it isn't necessarily what you planned. Natural happiness primarily relies on external factors, where synthetic happiness relies on the internal one. And so it can be more long-term, stable form of happiness than natural happiness. And that general happiness comes from a combination, probably of natural and synthetic happiness, and that freedom can create some really interesting challenges in happiness. But there are definitely things we can do to cultivate the perception of happiness. So an obvious one, developing better relationships. We know the importance of having good relationships, but how do we develop them? It can really be as simple as FaceTime right now during this pandemic with the people that you're caring about, or cultivating new relationships with. You can liven up a relationship with the people that you're trapped in the house with by doing something new together. You can reestablish date night or start a weekly game night. In our family, we've recently instituted weekly check-in meetings and a family and a couple adventure challenge every second week. So we alternate couple adventure and family adventure. You can reach out a family member with whom you've lost touch. You can try joining a group of like-minded individuals. Eventually, when we come out of our houses, we could join a walking group or learn a new skill. What we've also been doing in our household is planning for what we really want to do when all the limits are off. So we've been gathering travel guides for countries that we've always wanted to see and are making some notes and plans about what we might do. So it's easy to start to do that with your family, and that actually helps you to cultivate deeper relationships too. Gratitude is also a great way to foster a happier disposition. Again, this is kind of like accepting what you have. This is a quality of synthetic happiness. So there is a researcher, his name's Robert Emmons. He's been coined as the world's leading scientific expert on gratitude. And his findings show that people who regularly practice gratitude report experiencing more joy, pleasure, optimism, happiness, higher levels of positive emotions. So you want to make a distinction between feeling grateful and being grateful. So feelings, being grateful is a choice. Feeling grateful, you kind of, again, almost have to fake it till you make it. So a lot of the gratitude things that you can do are related to things that you can cultivate. So as an example, you can start a gratitude journal. And there was a blog post that I put up several years ago on doing gratitude journals. You can set a time every day to recall just like what you're grateful for. And you can reflect on those questions. Prayers of gratitude are considered in many spiritual traditions as a very potent form of prayer. You can get visual reminders as a great way to trigger mindfulness. You can practice smiling. You can practice saying thank you. Writing letters of appreciation regularly can really strengthen gratitude. Take those people that really have gone over and above for you and actually write a note or communicate with them. I've recently become acquainted with the 15-minute miracle gratitude process. That's one by Jacqueline Aldana. And that has proved to be a really interesting addition to my own processes. She's written a really brilliant little book. Again, it's called 15-Minute Miracle, and it shows gratitude processes. Also, research is growing on the connection that nature makes us healthier and happier people. There was a 30-day study that involved people doing something wild every day for 30 consecutive days. And then participants were completing surveys at the beginning and at the end about their perceived connection to nature, how they interacted with nature, how they felt about their health and happiness. And that study showed there was a statistically significant increase in people's health and happiness and connection to nature just by being encouraged to spend time with it. And amazingly, that newfound happiness was sustained for months following the challenge. So one theory accounting for that is there's this hypothesis called biophilia, which suggests that we love nature because we evolved in it. But, even if you look at hospital patients, if you have a group facing a brick wall, when another one looks out on trees and nature, the group who looks out on the brick wall were in the hospital longer, needed more meds, and had more medical complications. And I am personally thrilled to see so many more people outside than I have ever seen before. What a blessing that is. That has really actually improved based on isolation. And it was one of the few things that have kind of improved on isolation. Now, you can also cultivate mindfulness. So mindfulness is a mental state that you achieve by focusing your awareness on the present moment. And ultimately, mindfulness is a focus on the here and the now. And it's not easy. It does take practice. But research has shown that if you practice it regularly, you're happier because your thoughts are not consumed by thoughts of the fear of something yet to come, or trying to control something in the future, or analyzing things of the past. If you can cultivate mindfulness, you can become more centered, and you develop that inner resource that deepens your perception of happiness. So you're just ending the loop of negative thoughts. You can connect better with other people, and you can really enhance the experience of gratitude. And it's not a difficult technique. You can access a mindfulness meditation on the Whole-Life-Meditation site from last spring, because we had a group that met for meditation every morning from the shutdown for 64 days. And there's one up there for sure that's on mindfulness. Now, the other thing that research is showing that improves happiness is giving. So it's shown that if you possess wealth and material goods, that doesn't necessarily lead to happiness, but if you give them away, it actually does. So studies of people who practice volunteering shows that they have way better psychological and mental health and increased longevity. Donating money or spending money on experiences rather than on material things is definitely positively correlated with happiness. So if you're more generous and charitable, your amount of happiness actually increases with the amount of money that you give to people in need. And so you could always try to do all sorts of things with respect to that. I mean, I personally love supporting the Women for Women International, which basically teaches one woman per year, funded by me, to learn certain basic skills about how to raise families. It's about reproductive rights, about teaching women what their rights are in a country where they live, because many of them can't read. Teaching them to read if they can, also teaching them a trade over about an 8 to 9 month period. And so I just love the fact that I get letters from those people, from those women that just say, I was able to do this, I was able to do this. I also love doing Kiva loans, which is microfinancing. I don't know if you've ever tried that before, but microfinancing is where you you either donate or lend people who need money to further their businesses around the world, whatever that. I love investing in organic farm people. I wonder why, right? Or one time I actually did fund a Peruvian sock maker in the Andes, because I just thought everybody in the Andes, they are going to need wool socks. And this guy, he needs a new machine. So I definitely contributed to that. So you can find ways to engage in that, I think. And it does bring a certain quality of happiness. So certainly there's proven techniques to cultivate happiness. Savor your moment, be in the present moment. Use your time wisely, spend it with your family and cultivating relationships. Act happy, even if you fake smile for a while. Exercise. Cultivate mindfulness. Express your gratitude. Give more. De-traumatize when you can, to make yourself less vulnerable to continual re-traumatization, and cultivate maybe your quantum change. I just think that's the coolest thing, to push your happiness into a different direction. So as a final quote, I'm just going to write here, the key to happiness is knowing that you have the power to choose what to accept and what to let go. And I hope that you feel empowered and excited for that ability to some extent to really choose happiness. So here's the remaining 2 lectures in our series. Now, I apologize. I realized I had these backwards last time, or maybe even for the past couple of times. So the next lecture is about brain health in the end of April. And then we're going to do anti-aging secrets in May. And hopefully I will see you at both of them. And by May, I'm going to know what the next year's lineup is going to be like. But if there's something in particular you would like me to cover, by all means, let me know. I'm always looking for great ideas to serve you guys. So thank you. I hope that you got a bunch out of this and that you feel a bit empowered to participate in your own happiness. But if you have any further questions, post them to our Facebook or email me at the office. And other than that, I'm here to support you. Thanks for watching. I love to connect to my patient community to inform and inspire, and I hope you'll join us again in the near future. Don't forget to check out whole-life-medicine.com for more webinars and events.